My name is Josiah Gilliam, and I am the My Brother's Keeper coordinator in the Office of Equity for Mayor Bill Peduto. And we've been doing a series exploring the intersections of the My Brother's Keeper initiative, but recently, because of some great statewide, regional, and local efforts related to trauma, violence prevention, intervention, and a number of other related themes, we've been doing a series that really is kind of leaning in to that space and engaging with experts that understand this work at the community level and institutions where there's research and resources being brought to bear. And we had a great introductory conversation not too long ago where we talked about this topic in broad terms. And in speaking with the group, we felt like it was appropriate to do a deeper dive on this topic of trauma to understand what it is. There's a lot of buzzwords associated with it. What do those mean? What does the research say? What does neuroscience have to say about the realities of trauma on the brain? How does it show up in individuals' lives and in community? How does it affect the work that folks do who are serving and loving on folks that have experienced trauma? And what are some thoughtful ways to think about it? So today we have a really cool opportunity to engage with experts to do that deep dive. And I've really been looking forward to this conversation because there's more research than ever, and there's a chance to be nuanced and thoughtful in our understanding of this, and in terms of how we think about caring for folks. So without further ado, I'm going to do a round of introductions, so you have a chance to see who else is on the call or on the Zoom with us. And then we're just going to jump, right in and get to it. So, my friends, thank you so much for taking the time. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you. I've been looking forward to this. If you wouldn't mind, just your name and your organization and what you're coming to this conversation to accomplish. What's the why for why you're here today? And we'll start with Dr. Paula Powe.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Paula Powe. I'm a child psychiatrist. I work for the University of Pittsburgh, UPMC, Western Psych, at a particular clinic called Matilda Tice Early Childhood Education and Trauma Clinic. And in that realm, I focus on infant mental health, which is the social and emotional development of children from the ages of 0 to 5. And so I will talk about trauma in that particular age group, how it manifests, what sort of things cause it, and ultimately how we treat it. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Doctor. And Dr. Toya Jones, and let me just say, the last time you were on a broadcast, you weren't doctor yet. So congratulations to you on your accomplishment.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate being asked back. Thank you so much. I started off in trauma therapy with children and families, and I am a licensed clinical social worker, and my doctorate is in education. My organization that I founded with my husband, Reverend Cornell Jones, is Freedom Indeed LLC, where I work with incarcerated population, ex-offenders, and I know I just said I work with trauma survivors. Yes, I work with victims of trauma as well. And I've done, working with survivors of trauma for around 20 years now. And so I'm back in, doing some work with incarcerated populations with the United States Federal Courts. I also work at the University of Pittsburgh as a professor and the director of the bachelor's program. So, wear a lot of hats, a mom also, and a community activist as well. So thank you so much for having me back.
Thank you. And last but not least, Julius, thank you for being here, man. Your introduction as you would.
Thanks, Josiah. I feel a little awkward being the only one that doesn't have doctor before his name. I got some education to get. So again, as Josiah said, I'm Julius Boatwright. I serve with a community-based mental health org called Still Smiling, and we bridge the gap between Black people and mental health support. And what I bring to this conversation in terms of the why as it relates to trauma is I really want us to just be open and willing to just look at the complexity of trauma and how it manifests in people's lives, past, present, and future, and just really be open to embrace that conversation and sit with some of that complexity. And again, I'm grateful and honored to be a part of this conversation.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Dr. Paula, I'm going to start with you. I wonder, could you just tell us a little bit about, what motivated you to pursue this realm and field? And then I think you have some slides for us. We're going to turn it right over to you to walk us through them. But, how did you get into this work?
Yeah, thank you. I love actually telling this story. I took time off between undergrad and medical school, and I actually studied cancer. I thought I wanted to be a pediatric oncologist. It was wonderful, but ultimately I went to medical school open-minded. And in my first year, because I was older, I gravitated to someone else who was older because we were like, oh, these kids, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know life, right? And so subsequently, this person became my study buddy, but I learned that he had a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so at the time, I definitely assumed it was from a war, right? That he was some sort of a veteran. And he actually shared with me that he had been diagnosed at the NIH with PTSD secondary to childhood trauma. And I was like, what? So I didn't know anything about it. I was very curious. And also, if we're going to be honest, with me not knowing about mental health, I was, like, I need to find out about this. I need to kind of understand this better. And so as I dug a little bit, I learned how prevalent childhood trauma was. I learned how it's not talked about. And what happened was I was able to, because I was in a close relationship, I was able to watch how childhood trauma was playing out in this 30-year-old person's life. And it was blowing my mind. And then when I could go to a book and I could read, and then I would look over and he was doing that stuff, I was like, okay, wow, this is a science like the oncology that I was interested in. It's a similar science. And so subsequently, literally by the end of my first year of medical school, I knew I wanted child psychiatry specifically to work on the prevention of child abuse and trauma, because I guess my overall gut feeling was we shouldn't have to live like this, right? Like we shouldn't have to struggle throughout our lives because of the things that happen to us in our childhood, especially if it's preventable, right? And so subsequently, yeah, I've dedicated my entire life, the rest of it, towards working toward this. And I will segue now into my slides and kind of talk about trauma and kind of how it does manifest in early childhood. So yeah, I want to talk about trauma, and specifically with regard to the earliest years of life, 0 to 5 is kind of what I work with. So what is trauma to the developing brain? And I just want to talk very quickly, like, what is trauma, right? Trauma is different for everyone. What is trauma for you might not be trauma for me. And the reason why that is because it has so much to do with how we respond to what happened. So here are just some definitions: an emotional response to a terrible event. The response to an event that brings a person finds highly stressful. That stress is going to be important. Frightening, dangerous, or violent event, right? Something that is deeply distressing or disturbing. And when it comes to children, essentially, it's what happens when a child feels intensely threatened by something that they either go through or that they witness, right? And so one of the common things, and with the words I have here in red, what I think of is I think of stress, right? And it overwhelms the body's stress response. So let's talk a little bit about stress. There's the Center on the Developing Child. It's a consortium at Harvard, and they talk a lot about stress. And there are 3 types. So you have positive stress. So let's say a child just touches a hot stove really quickly, removes his hand. He's going to be stressed. His body will release stress hormones. It'll be quick. And ultimately, the goal with positive stress is that you learn a lesson. It's adaptive. It teaches you, don't do that again. Be careful, right? Then we have tolerable stress. So this is going to be serious but temporary elevation of your hormones. And I'm talking those fight, flight, freeze hormones, right? Like that stress response that it just comes automatically. And so think about this as, hearing suddenly that your favorite grandma passed away as a child, right? So that's going to be really shocking. That's going to be, like stressful, but ideally it's going to be buffered by the relationships that you have around you, right? So someone will come and comfort you, teach you how to kind of grieve appropriately, process that loss, that trauma, and ultimately that'll be a tolerable stress. And then there's toxic stress. And toxic stress is the stress that we're going to be talking about. That's the stress that causes these long-term effects in children. And so some of the situations in which toxic stress can occur, and again, I'm talking 0. Think of an infant. Think 0 to 1 years old. So toxic stress can happen in a situation, for instance, where let's say that there's postpartum depression. because subsequently what will happen is that postpartum mother won't be as responsive to the needs of the child as she otherwise could have been, right? And so like you can imagine a child in distress because he's hungry, he needs change. And if mom is kind of dealing with depression, not really able to be motivated and get up and, take care of the needs of that baby, you can see that fight, flight, freeze response is just going to be on. It's going to be on if there's no one or other support to kind of turn it off. Another good example for this is going to be like situations of domestic violence. So if there's kind of just overall chaos in the home or frustration in the home, high tension in the home. Although, and a lot of times what I hear, is like, yes, we would fight, but he was in the other room, or he was so small, he doesn't remember that, right? And so what I'm going to share today is an explanation of how brains remember that, right? So that sort of thing where a child will be frightened and be scared, have that fight, flight, freeze response turned on, not able to turn it off. That's what leads to toxic stress. And so I want to talk a bit about, again, this is just repeating what I've said. It's strong, frequent, or prolonged adversity without the adequate support that will ultimately turn off that fight, flight, or freeze response. And what science has found is that this actually changes the way that your DNA is expressed. So we're talking genes. It changes gene expression, and it can also change brain development. So I want to talk about brain development here. When we think about development of a brain, what we're talking about is that you have brain cells over here, you have brain cells over here. They reach out to each other and they make connections. It's this connections being built that ultimately make, it relates to the function of the brain, because the nerve cells need to connect and pass messages on to each other in order for development. And so it continues from the moment that we are conceived into adulthood. 90% of it happens between the ages of 0 to 3. And again, like I said, it's determined. Your genes determine what cells are going to connect, and your environment and your influence and your experiences determine how strongly they'll connect, if they'll ultimately disconnect, those sorts of things. Another important thing to talk about with brain development is that the brain is built bottom up, right? So you start at the brainstem, and you start there because that is the essential functions necessary for life. So I'm talking blood pressure, I'm talking heart rate. These are the things that if you don't have it, if it's not working, you will not be alive, okay? And as we move up from the bottom of the brain, and literally it's back here up to the front, you get more and more sophisticated, right? So this stuff back here is going to keep you alive. This stuff up here, this is self-actualization. This is who do I want to be when I grow up? This is what sort of like relationship would I like later in life, right? And so and you can see there again, as you move up, we call the cortex, right? The frontal lobe, right? It is literally the one that develops the last. And I will explain why this is important. It is important because it's almost like not exactly use it or lose it, but almost, right? And so what happens is the connections that are used often, they get strengthened, right? And so the connections that are used less frequently, they get weakened and they get pruned. So pruning is a natural process. Think about how you prune bushes. It is a natural process that happens, and the goal of it is actually to optimize the functioning of the brain. So you have this incredibly powerful organ. You don't want it wasting time doing stuff that doesn't matter. You don't want to pay attention to the snoring dogs in the middle of this situation, right? You want your brain to be able to say, here, let me focus and take care of what I need to take care of, right? And so again, 0 to 3, the most important period, and you can see around age 2 plus, you have the most connections you will ever have, and then they start to go away, okay? And again, that's a good thing, but you can imagine, like the last slide that I showed you, if you are in fight, flight, or freeze, the majority of 0 to 3, the connections in the back of your brain are gonna get really strong. And when it comes time to prune, those won't be the ones that are pruned, right? And the body only has so much energy. So while I'm focused at the base of my brain, there's not a lot of attention going to the front of my brain. And so when we talk about, the frontal lobe and being able to think about the future, plan for your life, what would you like, organization, these sorts of things, the connections in the frontal lobe are not built in the way that they otherwise would be in these situations of toxic stress. And so this slide right here explains this and kind of shows this in more detail. This is don't worry about the terms, but this is the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. So this is the top. This is this is what makes us humans and distinguishes us from bears, right? And so you can see in a situation of toxic stress, there are less connections and the connections are damaged, right? And so, and the prefrontal cortex is important for what we talk about executive functioning. So thinking before you act, planning, organizing, learning. The hippocampus here is important for memory, right? And so you can imagine the challenges that an individual would have if they're exposed to this toxic stress as an early trauma. Couple last things I do want to say, for instance, in my clinic, how does this show up? A lot of times, again, these executive functioning deficits will be diagnosed as ADHD. This is not the only way that you get a diagnosis of ADHD, but that ADHD is an executive functioning deficit, right? So these kids have difficulty paying attention. They have difficulty tending to what the teacher is saying, for instance. They have difficulty blocking out external information. Oftentimes you get distraction, right? Additionally, there's impulse control disorders, emotional regulation, dysregulation. You can't control your emotions. Something happens, you immediately just kind of like have a blow up. And as a kid continues to grow, substance use disorders are very intimately connected with this, as well as cognitive delays. And so a lot of times the kids who've been exposed to toxic stress, we also see that they end up in special education classes, right? And I think special ed has a good place and a positive place, but when there's a disproportionate amount of people going into special ed, I think that's a heads up. We need to pay attention to that. The last thing I want to talk about is the adverse childhood experiences study. This is a very high overview, but essentially what happened was this was a study of adults who were, I think they averaged in their 50s, but ultimately these two researchers, what they asked is, from the age of 0 to 18, did you experience any of these things? So emotional, physical, sexual abuse, emotional, physical neglect. Anyone in the household who was incarcerated, had a mental illness, had substance use? Did you witness domestic violence, and did you have parental separation? So these were all yes or no questions. And a yes got you a 1, a no got you 0. So you could get a score of 0 to 10. And I just want to show you very quickly the results. It's a busy slide, but I'll walk you through it. Again, here on the left, it's just going over again what those adverse childhood experiences were. It's notable that 2/3 of the population, this was about a study of 17,000 people, 2/3 of the population had at least one adverse experience. 12.5 had 4 or more. And so go up there to the right, with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, what these researchers found was that there was a graded association with worsening health outcomes as well as mental health outcomes. And so look, we're talking 3 times the levels of lung disease and smoking, 11 times the use of IV drugs, right? 14 times the number of suicide attempts. And again, you can read the rest, but you can ultimately see this isn't just mental health, right? So early childhood adversity that leads to toxic stress has very long-term outcomes. 2 last points. You can see over here at the bottom left, people who had 6 ACEs or more are at risk for dying 20 years earlier than someone who has an ACE score of 0. Again, huge public health implications. Lastly, I just want to take you to this triangle because it's like the theoretical model of how this might be the case, right? So you can see at the bottom, you have adverse childhood experiences. I kind of put in there that lead to toxic stress, right? Toxic stress leads to disrupted neurodevelopment. So your brain is built differently. You subsequently have social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, right? All of that functioning of those higher skills we talked about. You adopt health risk behaviors. You ultimately get disease, disability, and social problems, and that subsequently can lead to an early death. So I will conclude there and be open to questions that come at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Powe. Really appreciate the time that you took to put that together. Super informative. I'm going to turn right to Dr. Jones. I'm interested in what your reactions are to what you've heard, certainly material and ideas that you're familiar with. But yeah, where does your mind go when you hear that? And then I know you have some slides as well, and we'll let you walk us through those two.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump right into them because my reaction is actually in the slides. Thank you so much, Dr. Paula. That was wonderful. I think it's so important for folks, whether you have, higher education, high school diploma, just, making it through life, got street knowledge out the wazoo. This is so important for you to understand what your brain is going through, because no matter what, we all have a brain. If you are walking and talking, you got a brain. So to know what's happening within your brain, even if you can't remember the names of the parts of the brain or anything, it's still so very important that you know what your brain is going through when you've been exposed to a traumatic event. That's why it's important. And why is it important that I know this? Well, if I'm a parent, I can see these certain signals and signs in my child. If your kid is sneezing and coughing and they have a fever, nowadays we're like, oh no, the Rona done got them. We're taking them to the doctors immediately. And the doctor looks at them and looks at the symptoms and says, not Roro, this is just a regular cold, or this is allergies or something like that. When we get that kind of diagnosis and we know what is going on in our bodies or in any organ that is in our body, we have a sense of relief because we know how to handle it. Well, the same goes for your brain. And your brain is an organ. We keep forgetting that our brain is a special organ as part of our body, and our brain sometimes gets hurt and it gets ill and needs, some positive interruption. And so when I'm listening to Dr. Paula, I want to pick up where she left off and talk about, now that traumatic situation has happened, our brains are like, you ever get in a car accident or know someone in a car accident, they have whiplash and they're like, I feel okay, I'm all right. But then their shoulders are like this. And the next day they're like, oh shoot, my whole chest hurts, my back hurts, my head doesn't feel right. That's what your brain is doing when your brain goes through a traumatic event. And the trauma is not processing clearly and linearly. What happens with your trauma brain, this is what we call it in trauma therapy, we call it the trauma brain. It's the after effect after this horrific situation happened, or after a series of weird out, wrong type of stuff, just to unmask it. It's things that happen to you, like Dr. Paula was saying, that you just didn't have the capacity to deal with. After it happens doesn't mean it's all done. A lot of times I know my clients and a lot of people I work with, they're like, I'm all right, it's good. It's like that's the way it goes in the hood, and that's the life in it, okay, all that's well and good. And I'm thankful for your tenacity and your grit and all that. However, you have been affected. You have been affected. And a lot of times we know that you've been affected, or that we've been affected. Let me talk from that point of view, is that any stimuli similar to what happened to you comes through your five senses and jolts your memory and takes you back there. Your brain said, hey, this stuff is happening to you again. When really you're not reliving it, you're remembering it. And so your brain doesn't know the difference sometimes. And your body will go through this whole cycle of events. You'll have all these stress hormones coming out, the adrenaline and the cortisol from that fight, flight, or freeze response that Dr. Paula talked about. And what's happening is your brain is signaling that limbic system, that part of the brain that controls emotions and reactions. The amygdala says, we got a problem. It calls the rest of the body, like, we need to get up out of here, or we need to fight, or we need to do something about what's happening to me. Even if it's not happening again, the brain thinks it is. And that primitive part of your brain, the brainstem, the oldest part that Dr. Paula talked about, is the one that says, hey, there's some potential danger, and calls the amygdala and the limbic system and says, there is problems here. The frontal lobe that Dr. Paula talked about, our executive functioning of the brain, the part of the brain that says, well, okay, so this is what I'm gonna do. This is what's happening, and let me act like this and do this. That part gets shut off. It goes out the door. I call it the very bad executive director that goes to lunch every time there's a problem. That's what's happening. And so it's all shutting down. Well, what does this look like in children, in teenagers, and adults? My practice, I worked with children and teens for many years. I love teenagers. People say why, and I say, well, before it used to be because I didn't have teenagers. Well, now I have a 10 and a 14-year-old. So now, I still love them. I love working with them, and all the way through adults and family therapy and group therapy. And so that's my background. But the things that I've seen in my clients throughout the years are all these symptoms. I won't go one by one, and that's why I made up a chart. You can take a picture of the screen and really, break this down in yourself and who you see. But am I having memories and flashbacks? Am I thinking that this is happening again? Or memories popping in my head like I'm watching a movie or on a television screen? Am I having nightmares and dreams? And little ones will have night terrors where they wake up and scream and they're shaking. You can't wake them up. And it's really a horrific ordeal a lot of times for the parents, but we call them nighttime traumas as well. Are they dissociating or blanking out, or this look like here? Are you paying attention? What's going on? Is it looking like ADHD, ADD? They're hyperactive, or they're just withdrawn completely. Kiddos and teens have specifically, we'll talk about aches and pains in their body. I had a client that had all these stomach issues. She couldn't go to the bathroom. She couldn't hold food in sometimes. She went to the doctor multiple times. The doctor said, nothing's wrong. Nothing's the matter. It was the trauma really affecting her in that way. Destructive and harmful behavior. Okay, my tweenies and my teens get into some stuff. Legally, they might have some issues, or they're just doing really self-destructive, self-harm, cutting, burning themselves, drugs, alcohol, reckless driving behavior. All these things might sound familiar. Reenactment is big with children. I had a little kid that saw his brother get shot, and he came in with his mom while I was doing an assessment with the mom, and she said, "Oh no, he's okay. He's fine. He's acting fine." And when she said that, he was over in the corner going, so he was reenacting the shooting that he saw. In sexual abuse, reenactment can look like a little child acting out on another child that is around their age. When that big age difference comes in, that's usually predatory activity. But when they're around the same age, they're reenacting what actually happened to them. And I put moody, a very unclinical term. My teen is moody. My friend is all moody. They're snapping. That looks like trauma is affecting them big time when they're just irritable and angry and really don't know what to do with themselves sometimes. We know a lot of times, Dr. Paula mentioned, a lot of times PTSD diagnosis is saved up for our troops, and God bless our troops. But it's not just with our troops, it's with our troops out there on the street. It's with our troops, our mothers, raising these kids. We are the real troops. And it's happening in our community. And so sleep and appetite and isolating and numbing. And I've seen a lot of this come through with the COVID, because folks are staying, to themselves and not really knowing what to do with themselves. And a lot of times emotional numbing and isolation will come from that. I talked about concentration, being guilty. And, I should have never been there with him, or I shouldn't have never let I had a mother that said, I shouldn't have let my kid go to that party. Well, how many times do you let your kid go to a party, but he didn't come home that night? He was killed. And so she had that guilt and the shame. Regression, that can look like temper tantrums and bedwetting, but it can also show up in adults, with adults feeling and acting as if they were back when that assault happened to them. Hypervigilance is just being watchful. A lot of my clients need to sit with their back towards the wall because they can't have the door. They need to see the door. They need to look at everyone's hands. So they're might have a high startle response, or jumpy, or they're always scanning the room looking for danger. That's that primitive part of the brain looking for danger. Can't remember things. I don't want to do nothing. Every time I call you, you don't want to come out with us. That's that diminished interest in activities. The foreshortened future, sense of foreshortened future, I see a lot in my teens. They're calling 40-year-olds old heads. So I don't know if I'm gonna live to even be 21. Like that's an old age. I'm sitting there like, really? So that I might not be around, I might not live, I might not graduate. I have a client right now that's incarcerated in the federal court, and he said, I don't know what I'm gonna do when I get out. I don't know what these streets got for me. That's his way of saying, like, I don't know if I'm gonna live the next day when I get out. And so that is a sense of foreshortened future. Doing the most, okay? All the above, etc. Somebody's wilding out, they're doing the most, they're acting out of character, something's wrong. And so a lot of times trauma in our Black communities especially goes unresolved and unassessed and undetected. Why? Because it's perceived as it's another day. Okay, this happens, this is what goes on, but it's not normal, even though it's perceived as normal. So, how do we heal? And I don't know if you want to wait for this, Josiah, or you want me to continue just to talk about how do we heal. Give me thumbs up. What do you want me to do?
No, let's wait, because I think
Because
there's
I'm going to keep going if you don't stop me.
this has been really great so far. I want to bring Julius in to kind of round us out on this idea of trauma and how it shows up.
Nice.
I would love to talk about healing with everybody. I think we're really well positioned to do that. Thank you so much for those slides.
Oh, you're welcome.
Julius, man, where does your mind? What are your reactions to what you've heard so far? I want to start there, and then if you could, I would love to hear you describe how you or share how you describe what you do with still smiling to folks that might not be familiar.
Yeah, so we are positioned to do grassroots work with folks. So really being, as Toya mentioned, in the streets with folks, meeting them where they're at, figuratively and literally speaking. So I do have a couple questions that I do want to pose that I'll answer that'll help to illuminate that a little bit better. So as I'm listening to both Dr. Powe and Dr. Jones speak, it's really helping me do what Dr. Powe said as well, like connect those dots when you have those experiences with people who are your friends, your family members, or in your network. And I was just really moved by a lot of the information that I heard today. So a few questions that came up for me are, how does healing look for folks who have endured so much complex trauma, knowing that we're in the midst of a pandemic and so many folks are hyper vigilant and hyper anxious? So what does healing look like with that sort of level setting? And we take that into consideration. And how do we make space for folks to heal on their own terms and not on the terms that we establish or dictate for them? And the final question I really want to address is, what would it look like for us as a community and as a collective people to really reimagine what trauma-informed care looks like in the work that we do, with the historical evidence, the historical data, and what we're learning in today's society and the work that we do, and just interacting with people all together. So Josiah, to answer your question more directly, that's essentially what we do. We keep these three questions in mind when we work with people. So more specifically, we have a workforce development program that is specific for Black folks. And we know that Black folks experience trauma differently than other groups of folks. It's not about playing the trauma Olympics or saying that one person's trauma is worse or more worthy of something than another person's. But as Dr. Powe was going through the adverse childhood experiences, I remember when I did that, I took that assessment. I think my score was like an 8 or a 9, right? And I'm a person who runs a mental health organization, and maybe from the outside world, folks may perceive that, okay, Julius has it sort of all together, so to speak. But even me and my upbringing, I was exposed to a lot of those things that came up on that ACE study. So with the folks that we do work with, we are doing two things simultaneously. One, trying to equip them with the skills and the knowledge that they need to be able to go out and support other people who are experiencing mental health challenges and who have gone through traumatic experiences. So essentially everyone that they come in contact with, right? Everyone has a mental health story. We may not all have a mental health diagnosis, but we've all experienced some level of trauma and mental health challenge at some point in our lives. So we are providing psychoeducation, like Dr. Powe and Dr. Jones just went over, to let people know here's the science behind it, right? You don't necessarily need to understand all of the words, but just have a basic understanding of how your brain works, how these lived experiences impact your current thoughts and your behaviors and your beliefs that you operate by. And in addition to that psychoeducation, we realized very early on that we also have to provide therapeutic support for folks. Folks have often asked us, well, what kind of program is it? Is it a training program or is it a mental health support program? And it's at the intersection of both. Because what we found is that whenever we come in and we start talking about the psychoeducation component and a lot of the things that Dr. Jones and Dr. Powe just mentioned to us, folks immediately start to connect that to their own personal experiences. And they say, okay, well, this is what I experienced when I was a young person. Here's what my daughter or my son is currently experiencing. And I don't necessarily have the words or the skills or the knowledge to confidently handle it or deal with it. So we have that consultation with them, with other mental health professionals and their peers as well. And Josiah, you and I spoke about this prior to this conversation. It's just how do we give folks that space to really determine what healing looks like for them, knowing that all these layered, complex traumas are continuing to compound. But it seems as though society in the world is right. We're opening back up. We're getting back to business as usual. And some folks may not even be operating or functioning at that baseline. They may not have been at their own baseline of operating prior to the pandemic and prior to having all these things exacerbated by the pandemic by way of job loss, loss of connectivity to their peers and their loved ones, actual physical loss of people losing their life, and you lose your loved ones. So how do we make space for that with all of this knowledge and information that we have, and knowing that folks are just doing the best that they can, and sometimes that is good enough, even if it is at a level that is not ideal or is not on that fast track or pathway to healing. And Josiah, another thing we spoke about I think is important to talk about is, are folks ready to heal when they're introduced to it, right? How do we make space to give folks an opportunity to own their own healing process instead of us trying to put them on a specific track that we think they should be on? So again, I really think that combining the psychoeducation piece that we talked about earlier with the more informal understanding and these informal conversations of giving people an opportunity to explore their trauma and what it looks like and feels like for them. I think when we couple those two, that's when we can start to get on that track to healing.
Thank you, Julius. I'd like to ask a question to the group. Can we just sit with this idea of complex trauma? Because I've heard it mentioned before. How do we think about that term? And then and I'm wondering, let's just stay there for a second. Can someone kind of walk us through what complex trauma is?
So I'll start. And a lot of times I think in the field, we think about complex trauma almost in the context of treatment, because we have some very solid, trauma specific treatments that can help you resolve if one specific trauma happened to you. So say, maybe like Dr. Toya was mentioning, the car accident that happened, right? And everything was pretty okay until that car accident. And now I have all of these symptoms. Now I'm very uncomfortable in cars, or now sounds remind me of that moment and how terrified I was. Versus situations where, like my friend when I was in medical school, like with, for instance, that ACE study, if you have multiple of those events that have happened to you, so multiple times that you have been, your body's stress response system has been overwhelmed, then that again, and then depending on the age, right, the age is important too, but no matter what, that is not going to be resolved with just kind of talking about it. It's almost like when we think about the treatments, you literally have to say, okay, if you've had 10 things happen that were all traumatic, right? And this treatment is we're going to focus on one, we're going to talk about your trauma, we're going to process it, what it meant to you. How do you do that when it's 10? How do you do that when it's 20? How do you do that when it's my life, right? And now I'm 30 years old. And so complex trauma, unfortunately, still not yet recognized by the DSM, which is our psychiatric and psychology's like manual for diagnoses. But I do believe it's coming. There have been attempts to do it. And I think that overall people are understanding trauma and its complexity a lot more.
Thank you. And I'm wondering from all of your work, when you're encountering someone that's not ready, to Julius's point, so to speak, or is just trying to do the best they can to get to their own personal baseline, how do you approach that? Each of you have work that you do in that field, but how do you meet that person where they're at practically?
Thanks for doubling back on that, because I didn't want to miss that really important point that Brother Julius hit with, they're not ready, or what if they don't know if they're ready? And a lot of times what I'll tell loved ones, because they'll say they need therapy, they need some help. They acting crazy, and it comes out like that.
Yes.
And I'll say to them, when you are really talking to somebody that you love, and you can tell, they're not acting themselves. They're not doing things the way they used to. They're really suffering. They're struggling. They have all these symptoms that we talked about. You kind of gather receipts on them. You show them the evidence of the behaviors. And this is what I see differently in you. And I'm concerned about you. And this is what's happening. The same when you're making a self-assessment. I'm not feeling right. I'm not acting like I usually do. I'm not able to take care of the kids the way I used to. I'm missing paying the bills. And it ain't just because of my money, because that money's funny sometimes, but it's because my brain is just not able to focus, or I'm snapping. My relationship is up and down, and we're arguing. I feel physically ill. I can't sleep. All these things that you're thinking about, it's time that I need to pick up the phone and get some help. It's time. I might not be ready to go through what I know is probably going to be uncomfortable for a little bit. It's like cleaning a fish bowl. If you ever had a fish tank or a fish bowl, cleaning it is the worst part of owning a fish. You can tell it's dirty, but when you start getting there, moving the rocks around and all the poo-poo and the caca comes out, you're like, oh, this water is really dirty. That's what therapy feels like initially. Then you clean it all up and you set the little trees in right, put that clear water in, and the fish seems to swim happier and just backstroking, doing its thing. That's what it feels like. You take a walk with your clinician, you pick who you want, and you make sure it's the right one for your issues or what you're dealing with. I've gone as far as I can go. Everything I'm doing isn't working. So I might say, I'm not ready yet. But is your body and your brain telling you, yes, you are. You're ready, and you better get in there quick, because a high percentage of African Americans usually come in through emergency, Western psych and things of that matter, because we wait to the last minute and we say, I'm all right, and I feel some kind of way, but I'm gonna be all right. And really, you need that extra help. You need that assistance. You wouldn't walk around with a broken leg and walk on your leg talking about I'm all right. You would go to the emergency room, you would go to the doctors, and you would get that stitched up, casted up, get your medicine, and go on along your way. I'm so glad that Julius brought that up. Oftentimes we're not ready. And so as clinicians, we meet them where they are. We're not pushing them into doing a whole bunch of stuff they're not ready to do, but we're normalizing and taking the stigma of mental health and therapy away and replacing it with, this is normal. You are reacting normally to an abnormal, messed up situation. That's what's happening. You're not messed up. You're not crazy. The crap that happened to you was crazy. If you have complex trauma and been sexually assaulted multiple times, you have a cinder block full, a garage full of cinder blocks and just stacking up. That's not on you. That's on the people that did that to you.
Mm.
So you're reacting in the most normal way that you know how. That's okay. Now, we're not going to leave it there, because unresolved trauma is a wildebeest of a mess. And then all sorts of things happen, like the self-harm and the substance abuse and all these things. And you don't want it to turn around into that. What you want to do is heal the pain, and it can be healed. The pain can be healed with the proper tools and the proper guidance.
Thank you. Yeah, so let's use our remaining time to talk about healing. We've talked about trauma, we've talked about meeting folks where they're at. We've talked about some thinking around how you might approach it. What's possible, with healing? What do interventions look like? What do treatments look like? What do resources, look like? And I'll just open up to anyone who wants to, to start, because I think each of you have an interesting take, on what this looks like. So whoever wants to begin, and then we'll go around.
I'll chime in. And it's almost piggybacking off of what Dr. Jones and Dr. Powe just said. For me, I think a lot about what I call like scenario planning. And I think in our mental health and therapeutic space, it may liken itself to like Gestalt therapy. I'm not an expert in Gestalt therapy, but from what I understand about it, the foundation or core of it is about raising people's awareness, and not necessarily looking at things as like an either or, but it could be an and a both, right? So for me, an example that I would give for myself is that I sometimes, like Dr. Jones said, don't want to necessarily clean out that tank, because I know what's under those rocks. I know how, gritty and grimy and painful it's going to be when I uncover what's under those rocks, right? That's why the rocks are there nice and pretty, and you can't really see what's underneath them, right? Because I've gotten accustomed to just swimming around, but there's that dirt and that gook, right, collecting on the rocks. And when I take the time to think about, okay, when I turn this rock over, what's going to be underneath it, right? And what does that mean for me? How is that going to make me feel? What kind of things is it going to bring up for me in terms of memories and loss and grief? And does that feel good in that moment, or even the length of time that I'm trying to work through and process those emotions? Absolutely not. It's some of the hardest work, if not the hardest kind of work that you'll ever do on yourself as a human being. I think the more that we put ourselves in position to let folks do that on their own as well, or walk that journey with them, to say, what might it look like, if you do this? What might it look like if you do that? Because for me, I have to admit, Dr. Jones, I'm one of those people that I would be walking around on a broken leg, and people would be like, what are you? Go to the hospital, Julius. Like, you have insurance, go get your leg fixed. But for me, it's like, what's on the other side, right? The fear of what's on the other side. So it's not even that I don't want to get well or become well, it's that I'm fearful of what's on the other side. So I think that brings me to the education piece. Sometimes we just don't know what we don't know. So when we start talking to people about, healing is like abstract, right? It's like, what does that even mean? Healing is just this sort of arbitrary thing, but healing is, or could be, going to therapy. And here's what going to therapy looks like. Here's what the wait time could be like. Here is how you can vet a therapist. If you get one therapist, you don't have to stick with them. You can pick another therapist. You can find one that has a certain specialty. You can talk to them before you see the therapist. You can discontinue if you're 5 sessions in and you want a new therapist. Like, really educating folks on what different healing journeys actually look like, so then they can make a determination, with guided support from a professional and their peers, on what is the best healing journey and track for them in that particular moment in time.
I love that. Doctors, what do we What do we think?
So I'll just speak really quickly to like healing with regard to, again, young children.
Yes.
So thinking children 0 to about 5 years old and who've experienced the trauma. And I guess I'll say like I'm a big mama bear, bigger than I realized, and even before I had my own child, because I'm incredibly protective of children, just because literally they hold so much potential. And so I'm a huge advocate for treatment. And treatment for these young children will be what we call dyadic, meaning that it won't be just the child who's in therapy, but it's also going to be an adult, a caregiver, a parent with them. And the reason for that, if you remember what I talked about with regard to trauma and that overwhelming stress, that overwhelming fear, the role of that parent or caregiver is going to be to help secure that child in a way that that child wasn't secured previously, right? And again, you have the ability, because the brain, what we call it neuroplasticity, meaning it's plastic, it can move, it can change. And so the goal is to give that child a solid, nurturing, and supportive relationship with this adult or caregiver that will subsequently help them relearn, appropriate levels of fear, not to fear the things that are not actually happening, those memories that come back from the past. And it's also important, a lot of times what you find is that you also have to help the parent heal, because intergenerational trauma is real. And again, understanding the potential trajectories for children who've gone through trauma and do not get healing, right? We want to stop these cycles, especially of the inadvertent trauma. Again, some of those things on the ACEs study are very, co-mission, but some of them are omission. And so again, like Julius was saying, starting with the psychoeducation, I need to teach you what happens. I need to show you what healing can look like for you. And just really kind of working it in that way, but as protective as we can help adults be, and not just parents and caregivers. I'm talking the coaches, I'm talking the teachers, I'm talking, the neighbors. All of that is very important. And so that's how we do it in the younger age children.
Thank you.
Exactly. I totally agree with that. I want to say that Black folk, we heal differently. And I don't know if there's any scientific evidence about it, but I know there's anecdotal evidence, which means we observe that we heal differently. We need different methods in different ways, and not just the European American ways. CBT has over 1,000 studies that supports that it is effective. And I teach CBT, so I'm not knocking CBT.
And CBT, for folks that don't know, is
I'm sorry, cognitive behavioral therapy. Thank you. And trauma focused CBTs for children, and it's very effective and it works. However, we have to tailor make these evidence-based practices for our people. And so Black folk, we are tribal people. We are, congregational people. We need our faith, and we need our brown skin around us. We need our music to heal. We need the kitchen table. We need our hair braided and, and talk about our issues. And we need to go Big Mama's house and get some cornbread with honey. This is the way we heal. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's right. And we put it with other evidence-based methods, and we heal that way. So we can't forget about our faith and our spirituality. We can't forget about, those informal ways of healing that are in our community, those community leaders that are like mothers and fathers to us, and uncles and big cousins. We use those folks to heal. There's a book by Dr. Joy DeGruy called Post-Traumatic Slave Disorder. She talks about a time when she visited South Africa, and she was crying about all of the injustice and the poverty and the hunger that she saw. And the folks in the village, the women in the village, gathered around her. They didn't offer her tissues. They didn't say, believe in yourself and your inner self, or they didn't do any of that. They sang songs of healing in 4-part harmony. Now, I'm a singer, and so 4-part harmony is like delicious, delicious German chocolate or something. I'm trying to think of what it is, but it sounds so wonderful. And they're singing back and forth, offering songs of healing until she stopped crying and smiled and laughed with those in the village. Well, they didn't have, wait a minute. They didn't have these methods, but that is the way they healed within our village. Well, we come from Africa, those of us that are African American. And so rhythms and movement and song, these should be incorporated in our healing. We don't heal the same. And so our approach needs to be different. And we don't need to abandon the ways that are scientifically proven to help. We need to join. They can be co-joined. And that can be a part of our healing, including our family and our friends in our healing process.
Thank you so much. Well, I think while we could clearly spend so much more time, listening, I want to bring the conversation to a close, but not before I give an opportunity for you all to point folks to where they can learn more. Where can they learn more about mental health supports, trauma supports? Where can they learn more information about the concepts and the themes that we have covered today? And then we'll do one last pass of questions about final encouragements. But if as you're engaging with neighbors, where should they go to learn more? And if they need support, to get support, or if they know someone that should get support, how do they reach out?
So our website is too long, but I will tell you that if you Google Matilda Tice, so that is THEISS, you will find us in the UPM system, and that is going to be, again, specifically for children ages 0 to 5. We have a therapeutic nursery and preschool that actually offers free care in addition to the treatment. And if you have children ages, any age above that, up to 17 years old, who has experienced trauma, we also have expanded our services recently to treat them with trauma-based therapy. So again, Matilda Tice, THEISS. Google it. It's a UPMC system, but you will find us. Just reach out.
Thank you, Dr. Powe. Dr. Jones.
I want to say there are several clinicians, Black clinicians, in our community. Julius has a directory. A lot of people call Julius to say, where should I go to therapy? I love that he collected these names and these locations. So I'll let him talk about that if he'd like. But there are several places that I know that specifically, I want to say you want to get someone that is a trauma specialist, someone that has experience in trauma, if that is what you're going for. You wouldn't go, to a podiatrist if you had all of these eye problems or, whatever. You're going to go to an eye doctor, ophthalmologist, and get yourself checked out. And so you want to be very specific in that. But I know Gwen's Girls has teenagers, and the therapy department, because I'm the clinical coordinator for the therapy department, I know what it's about there. Vision Towards Peace. They have all Black clinicians there. I don't want to keep naming people because they're going to get mad at me, but Women's Center and Shelter, Center for Victims, these places are trauma specific. Center for Traumatic Stress on the north side, Pittsburgh Action Against Rape. These are all trauma specific facilities. So find a place. You can even go through your insurance company and say, I want a trauma specialist, I want people of color, or I want a group, because we heal in groups too, healing circles and things like that. And so I would like that, and your insurance provider will get you connected.
All right, thank you so much. And Julius.
Thank you, doctors. I'll just compliment what they said. So we being Still Smiling, our organization is very aware that Black folks in particular, some folks may not have the usual access to getting mental health services, and access is very broad. And one of the ways that we're trying to focus in on that is the financial access that comes with it. So folks, even if they do have a certain level of insurance, they may have a co-payment of a certain amount of money that they cannot afford. And there are a lot of folks, particularly folks that we engage with at the community level, at the grassroots level, who are currently underinsured or altogether uninsured. So we have what's called the Black Mental Health Fund. Over the past 14 months, we know it's been well before that, but particularly over the past 14 months, Black folks have been enduring higher levels of stress and complex trauma. And as one of the potential solutions to that, we created this Black Mental Health Fund. So essentially, if you are a Black individual within Allegheny County and you are looking to get help paying for mental or behavioral health treatment services, you can contact Still Smiling and we will have that conversation with you, gather the information, and do our very best to work with you to get you connected with an appropriate level of professional. I will say as a caveat, more Black folks are reaching out for support. More Black folks are asking to be connected with Black clinicians, and that does create some challenges in terms of potential wait times and whatnot. But it's a beautiful thing to see that more people are they're owning their own healing journeys. So it's still STEEL Smiling pgh.org, and we'd love to walk that journey with you.
Thank you all so much. We're going to wrap it up here. Just final encouragements for folks that are on your heart after this conversation, whether they're on their own healing journey or standing in faith and belief for someone that they love. Where does your mind go to encourage them in this moment? And we'll just go right back around. Dr. Powe.
What I would say is trauma is universal. Similar to what Dr. Toya was saying, it's not that there's something wrong with you. It is that something has happened to you. And I think, again, it's easy for it to be stigmatizing. It's easy to think that you're the only one. You're not. And again, it's almost like similar to, if people could see on us what is inside of us. I think, honestly, we feel a little bit closer to one another because you would realize you're not the only one. So I would just encourage you. And like Julius said, and I love that you were so transparent and shared, it's hard. It is hard work. But ultimately, the result and the healing on the other side is not just good for you. It's good for everyone who you love, everyone who you touch, everyone who you will influence. So I encourage you to seek help and support, and we're here for you.
Thank you. It's beautiful. Dr. Jones.
We have a funny saying in my family, you're no good for nobody if you don't take care of yourself. And so we'll say that to each other around the house. Look at you, you're no good for nobody. That means you have to do some self-care. You got to get yourself up and exercise and eat right, put the Fritos down. What are you doing? You know you're doing these things to yourself. You might have heard our presentation today and thought, well, I'm not there yet. Okay, that's good. Let's keep on the track and maybe go backwards so that you don't get there where you're having all these symptoms. So it's better to prevent by really taking care of your temple, taking care of yourself, taking care of your mind, turning off the news, getting those nutrients in water, big jugs of water. I drink a big jug of water every day. Keeping yourself healthy, keeping yourself around people that make you laugh and that you can share your heart with. Make sure you're structuring that time at work where you're not always working and barely playing. So balance that out and make sure spiritually you are in tune and you are intact, whatever that means, whatever religion you are. If it means walking through the woods and hearing the birds chirp, that is spirituality as well. Making sure that's balanced out so that you are always taking care of yourself and that you're good for other people.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Julius.
I'll just put a few words into the space. Grace, mercy, and self-compassion. I think that when we're hurting, we really want to get to healing quickly. And I think that's second nature. That's nature to want to do that, right? To want to get over the thing that's hurting us and hindering us from reaching our full potential. The most beautiful things that I've experienced in my life have been birthed out of traumatic experiences, and my willingness and my ability to sit in those traumatic experiences or to observe them and really try to gather the lessons from them and not necessarily run away from that trauma, but really, as piggybacking on what Dr. Jones said, really asking the universe, asking our ancestors, asking whatever it is that you believe in, what's the lesson in this? How can I gain something to become more resilient, to become more strong, to become more of who I was created to be? So I would encourage folks to sit with that.
It's wonderful. Well, thank you each again so much for your time. And for those that are with us, live in the moment or finding this on the internet after, thank you for taking the time as well and for your interest in these topics. Certainly some heavy material, but we hope folks feel encouraged by what has been shared. And we definitely encourage you to look up each of the organizations and get plugged in as makes sense, and keep an eye out for additional conversations where we're going to continue to unpack these themes and bring relevant information, opportunities, resources, and ideally encouragement to folks as we're all navigating our own lives and coming out of the pandemic. I mean, what a well-timed discussion to really talk about, where we've been over the past, to Julius' point, 14 months. And I think an invitation to think about what new normals might look like at the individual, community, city, regional level. So thank you all again so much, and we'll see you next time.